Everyone, welcome to the workshop on an introduction to the Dutch political system. So this will be the first video in a series in which I'm going to talk to you about the Netherlands specifically, and I'm just going to talk today about just the very basics about how you can get, um, policies through the Netherlands, how things work, so you know this when you are debating them. So what I'm going to talk about is firstly, just the Dutch political institutions. So how do policies get passed? Talking about the first and second chamber. I also will have talk a bit about the motions that are specifically related to these bodies. Then I'm going to talk about how you have checks and balances in the Netherlands, how people might try to set motions about them, and also I'm going to talk lastly about the political geography of the Netherlands. So what does the Netherlands look like um, politically and socially and culturally in different regions? And what does this mean for debating it or just, general knowledge that you can have about it? So let's just immediately start firstly with the first point I'm going to discuss, which is maybe ironically the second chamber. So this is actually the body that proposes policies and motions, which is why I'm going to discuss this first. So the goal is just very simple. You have a coalition or a government, which is going to propose motions or policies. That happens here. And also, you have here the opposition parties, where they're to hold the cabinet accountable. This can be by questioning policies or questioning politicians. This can be by starting new research into what a specific policy does, or asking, doing research into what is happening in a specific ministry. And they can also, of course, ask for um, evidence or discussions, for example, what happened during the specific discussions and like transcripts of those discussions in, for example, a ministry. And these are just ways that you can have accountability against this government. Um, there are also commissions, and they are thematic. So let's say you have a commission about education. There are people who are on and talk about education, discuss like their specific niche that they focus on. And this is important for the way policy gets created. So normally what happens is you just have a policy that's going to be proposed by either the coalition or a party, or that, for example, an opposition party within the second chamber. Then it needs to go past all the ministers. Then they say, yeah, this is a good policy or this is not a good policy. Then an advisory body checks whether the policy is in line with the Dutch constitution and such or European law, and then gives advice based on that. Then it goes to a commission, and in this commission, it gets discussed content-wise. And this can be, do we think this is a good plan in the first place? Do we think this is executable? Does this actually lead to the consequences we wanted to happen? All this kind of stuff. So, for example, you have a policy which is you want to ban religious schools. Then you have a committee that's specifically about, education, who then discusses this. And then after that, it's been discussed by this committee and maybe gives advice and comments. Then it gets discussed in the second chamber and it gets voted on. So this is important, especially when you look at small parties, because suggesting specific kind of like motions or starting, asking for like research or asking for files, all those things are something that small parties can do. They can ask questions during discussions. All that's all fine. But what tends to be a problem for a lot of small parties is doing all of it at the same time, but also going especially to these committees because they just do not simply have enough members to be able to go to every single one of them, which means they tend to need to prioritize what they find thematically important and focus on those ones. So in general, it is one of those things where it isn't necessarily how do you say it? Like it isn't always as easy as a small party to actually be able to form opposition, which is important, especially when you're going to discuss whether we should have more or less small parties within Dutch politics. Now, then of course a bit more about how politics are created, but who actually discusses them? Those are politicians and how they get elected. What we have is a proportional electoral system. This is not the same as what the UK has, which is where they have districts, where if you win, for example, a specific district in a specific place, like a specific municipality or city, then you get a seat. In Netherlands, you just need to get enough votes to be able to get a seat in the first place. So that just shows you, shows you how these people get elected. And there's also no electoral threshold. So, for example, Germany does have one. And this basically means that if on paper you would have gotten 3 seats, but the electoral threshold is on 5, all that means is that you do not get into parliament. You don't get those 3 seats because you don't have the required 5 minimum seats to get in. This means that there are just a lot of small parties within the second chamber because there is just no threshold and they just have enough votes to get only one. Now, what are the other things you could talk about is because you have so many small parties, you need to form a coalition. So it's not possible for one party to have the majority within the second chamber. This is, the last time it happened, I think it happened in like the 60s. So it's very, very, very uncommon. So it's not like the UK where, again, either Conservatives or Labour win and they practically just form a majority. Um, this means a couple of things about Dutch politics is, firstly, people do, when they vote, expect at least some things to be maybe given up. Like you don't vote specifically for 100% of policy because you just believe that you will have to give up some of these things when you're forming a coalition. They do also, there's also like whenever you have elections, a bit of a dance of who is willing to work with whom. So sometimes you might say, we as a center-right party do not want to work with a very right-wing party, extreme right-wing party, because they're too extreme. We don't think they're trustworthy, all this kind of stuff. Or you can say, we as a center-right, we don't want to work with center-left because they're too oppositional to what we want. So these are all kind of like things that happen within the election, and also makes it kind of like difficult beforehand to know what really happens because you don't really know who's going to win. You don't really know who's like going to form coalition talks. You don't know how important they are. But it does also show you why sometimes small parties might be important because sometimes you do just need the 5 seats of that one specific small party to be able to form a majority, which is why it's quite way for them to still have some power or be relevant. And this has happened before where you need to have a small party in the coalition. So another thing is there has been quite an increase in the amount of time it takes for a coalition to be formed. Sorry. I've done a video before which goes into the details of what happens electorally in the last couple of years, why coalitions have fallen, what specific crises have happened, and what that meant for political parties. I'm not going to go into detail about that in this workshop. You can look at that video. But basically, the idea is this has been taking longer and longer time to really get it done. Part of this is because there are so many small parties, so there's a lot of fragmentation, which means it's hard for people to agree. It's hard to form a majority. And also, there's this polarization, so especially the right wing has become more right wing, which means that as a consequence, they have tried to say that they don't want to work with other very far right wing parties. So, for example, the VVD has become more right wing and said they don't want to work with the PVV, which is way more right wing and more radical. But also, as a consequence, don't want to work with any left wing parties because they're too far left wing and all this kind of stuff. It has happened in the past that there were center left and center right parties coming together to form a coalition. I think the early this was in the 2000s. This was like a cabinet purple, it was called. But the main issue was just that right now the right has come too far to the right to really be able to consider a coalition with the left, which is also a reason why it takes long because you just basically are excluding things that would only be a possibility for a majority, and then people don't want to go back on the promises they've made during the elections, and all that just makes it very hard. So, given this, besides the discussion you can have about whether small parties are good or bad within the Netherlands, you can talk about also if whether or not you should force re-elections if no coalition is formed after 3 months. And the things that you can talk about in this motion, I'm not going to go into too much depth, just give you a couple of pointers for you to think about is, firstly, what does this mean for when people are going to have election cycles? So it might mean that they are going to be less hardline. So they're going to be less likely, we don't want to work with this party. We're not gonna form a coalition when X and Y and Z doesn't happen. And you can say this is good because it makes it easier for coalitions to happen. It makes it easier to have more representative policies because there's more horse trading within it. You can say this in of itself is actually bad on the opposition because there's a lot of lack of clarity. So you can say now when the VVD says we don't want to work with either the Labour or the XGPV, there's clarity for the voters. Now they can't really, which makes it maybe a higher burden for them to vote, especially if you also can't really hardline policies. That would be something you could say on specifically that topic. You can also say, of course, on this motion, well, what does this mean for coalition talks? So you say the pressure is good because this means that you get more, like you most likely get the same coalitions and the same policy platform, but it is just that it happens quicker. On opposition, you might say, actually, this pressure means that there's a lot of force trading and very quickness going on, which means that actually the plans might not be as thought through, they might not be as consistent, they might not be economically as sound because you don't have as much time to really align the programs. Um, and also you could say that maybe this leads to pressure that can be used, e.g., big political party that's the majority doesn't have to form a coalition. What tends to happen in the next election cycle is that they lose voters. And this can be a tactical thing that's used by one of the parties who could be in a coalition to basically say, we're going to stall this to basically break coalition. We get more votes, and then we will be the one who is going to give the minister president or something like that. Those are all kind of like things that can continue, kind of like what the incentives become, how the coalition like process looks like, and these kinds of things. So that's just the second chamber. So let's just discuss when a specific policy now gets through and then goes to the first chamber. So what is exactly the first chamber? Just give me a second. So the goal or idea of this first chamber is just to check whether a policy should be, is good enough to get voted through. So just vote yes or no. They don't have the option, like the second chamber or like part of the second chamber, to give advice to say, you need to change this, and then we'll implement it. Or that kind of stuff. Just say yes or no vote. The ideas that is just about to what extent can this policy just be implemented? Is it too vague? And is it in line with European laws? So let's say, for example, you have a motion about making Antifa a terrorist organization or trying to ban it. You can say, well, actually, a policy can be implemented because the way you are talking about terrorism or Antifa is too vague. And you haven't specified it. So therefore, it's not allowed. You can also say it's against our own constitution, and therefore it should be implemented because it goes against the principle. Yada, yada. So that's kind of like the ideal version of times is given in the representation of the first chamber. But if you actually look at the discussions about policies, it isn't always actually as gray or as neutral. So, for example, in 2024, there was a proposed motion from the second chamber to actually higher the minimum wage by, I think, 1.5%, something like that. And if you look at discussions, the people who are in favor of the policy talk about why it would be very good for people who are poor, on the ground, wage go up, all this kind of stuff. And on opposition, it says actually it's not executable because it would be very bad for, the investment climate. It would be very bad for companies, all this kind of stuff, which is why we should vote against these kind of things. So it is not necessarily always just about this rational, like, is this a good law? Is it not a good law? It's also just based on politics, why something is voted in favor of or against. Okay. Like I said, what are the powers then? It's just to vote yes or no on policy, and very rare it says no. Let's say it is very political, or it can be political, and it's not always just pragmatic. Um, Overall, they do vote in most of the policy. Um, where I do enter the caveat that oftentimes when policy does get created within the second chamber, it is also with the idea they do need to have the first chamber like to agree with this policy. And I think here you could then say this is and this is also why you could say it's not necessarily something about the first chamber itself that it allows for most policy to pass through. Is it this also what policies get through the second chamber in the first place? Other powers that it does have is that it can make policy slower because it can discuss it. It might, vote against it because of like very, small minor things. And also it can ask for explanations. So say you say this term, how would you implement this, all this kind of stuff. Okay, now who are people then who are voted in here? So they're voted indirectly because we just have provincial elections. So you have a province. There you just have again representative proportional electoral system within those provinces. Then you get an outcome. Then those provinces choose members of the first chamber, which just means that the people who are there do have political background. So they are, for example, for the Dutch Labour Party, and then they've already had experience oftentimes either in the second chamber or on the provincial level or in a municipality level, and then they go to the first chamber, and then they work part time. So it's not one of those because there aren't as many discussions, not as many committees, there aren't as many research things that can be done. They just only get voted like they only have like half work to be done, and therefore they only work part time, and the other part they just work for like for example a company or whatever. So this is this is kind of like who these people are. Let's say you have a motion, which is also a bit of a classic one in the Netherlands, is this has removed the first chamber from Dutch politics. If you have this motion, you can talk about what kind of policy will get passed. So you can say right now, policies are maybe delayed, so it's much quicker if you just basically remove the first chamber. On the opposition side, you might say actually it's good to actually have this because the first chamber makes the policies more representative. Because the first and second chamber aren't always filled at the same election cycle, so provincial elections lag behind the national elections, which means that there might be a different outcome as that. Which means that the first chamber might have, for example, more center parties or more left wing parties. Which means that if they still want to get a majority of the things go through, they still need to they still need to kind of like somewhat cater to this group, which means that the policy can be as the extreme, caters to more people, is more representative, the policy is good. Let's talk about who these politicians are. So you could say the fact they do have half a job and the other half is oftentimes working. This means that they will just, for example, like, might have interest within a specific sector, which might mean that might not be actually that good because they might have some conflict of interest happens there. On the opposition, you might say actually it's good that they have experience in this field because if they also know how policies can actually implement it and affect, you know, uh, you know, actually affect companies. This is why policy should maybe not voted in or against. Again, noting that they don't really create policies; they just only vote in policies that are already created. So it's not about really nefarious interest. Oftentimes, it's more about will this maybe negative influence, yes or no, and then maybe here the fact that they do have experience on the sector does give them maybe a leg up. Again, other things you could consider. Uh, how does this really affect how parties maybe work, what kind of like representation can you have. All of these kind of things can also be something that you were uh, discussing within this motion, but this is just maybe just a couple of points that you can consider specifically with the context I already explained with how Dutch politics works. So that's just the bodies that we have in those that are specific to creating policies. Now let's go to the Raad van State. The reason why I'm going to talk about this body is because it's been in the news recently because of the last election cycle, but also I think it gives a couple of nuances to how policy gets created. So let's just start with the first part of it. So it's the advisory board. So let's say you have a policy that gets implemented. Like I said, after it goes to ministers, it goes to a advisory board to check if it is in line with law. That is this specific advisory board. This advisory board is basically just only checking is this law a good law based on principles of the law. Is clear enough? Do judges and other judicial individuals know what this law means and how to implement this and enforce this? Is this in line with other laws? All that kind of stuff. So because it only gives advice, it is basically just technocratic. And this election is kind of like difficult because you get a point for life, but then the position is open for a year and people can apply, but there's a minimum requirement that you do have a law or policy background, and therefore you can actually, you are good. And then it's based on technically the king chooses, but it chooses based on advice from both the council and also specific ministers. So the Minister of Internal Affairs and the Minister of Justice. And then also it does have like also the parliament does have some say over it and like give advice. But because the king actually doesn't choose, but it's rather the vice president in practice, it kind of like becomes semi-democratic, but like there's advice from different sides, and it's very difficult to really explain how this looks like. I most likely losing some news in this explanation already. But just for all intents and purposes, it's just a technocratic party. Um, who then is right now in this body, just politically? 5 out of 17 of the council have a political background. So these are people who used to be part of like three parties. Either they were from the Labour Party, the Green Left Labour Party, or from D66, which is now the biggest party in the Netherlands, or it is the SGP, which is the Conservative Party, which we'll talk about a bit later. Details don't really matter for the very big reason that one, they are there specifically for the reason that it's just is the good law or not. Two, there are 12 people who are just have unknown preference, so they were never part of a specific party. They just were either lawyers or judges or whatever. They had that experience, and we don't know what their voting preferences is, and if they have voted at all. And of course, all advice needs to be unanimous. So, like even like people who are there, even if you have two right-wing people there, which would be, you know, at least a bare minimum there. At least we know one of them is right wing or conservative. At least it is definitely representing a lot of people. It needs to be unanimous. So there isn't as much of like a left leaning tide here. Why am I saying this? Is because it has been criticized by the Farmers Party, which is the BBB, that is too left leaning or too specifically too much like a D66 party. So that is why I'm bringing up this part, but actually it is not. So let's say you have a that's just the advisory part. Then there's also a legal body. So this is kind of like just the highest court. So if there is something that you do not agree with a specific previous court decision, you can go to this body to just say we want to appeal. So it's kind of like the Supreme Court of Justices of the US. You can also just strike down laws, and this can be either based because there's a social movement who is basically saying that, hey, look, this law is not in line with the European law, or it's not in line with like another kind of like principal law that we already have, or it can just be on its own volition. So it can say, hey, look, uh, we have this law. We're going to do research into this, and we find out that actually it is not aligned with European law, it doesn't fulfill the requirements for this, and therefore it's going to be stricken out. Now, this is not like insignificant. A couple of things is that this is happening with, for example, migration. So we have, um, for example, like places where we hold asylum seekers, which might be done or found out to be illegal and have this stricken down, and therefore they need to be replaced, which is done by this body. But more importantly, we had a nitrogen crisis. And to just give you a short overview of this, we signed the EU treaty, which says we're going to reduce nitrogen. The Netherlands said, oh, we're going to allow you to still do nitrogen projects. But what we're also going to do is we're going to basically tell you that in the future, you just need to reduce it. So we'll just allow it now with the idea that later it might be, fixed. Like we find a solution. And then basically what happened is we just kept postponing this and we just kept doing way more than we actually allowed to. So then this part, so this Council of the State, part of the Council of the State, struck down that law. That basically meant that all projects, like building projects, all this kind of stuff, are now unable to be started because we just have a nitrogen crisis. So if we want to build more houses, if we want to build more prisons because we have overfull prisons, if you want to do anything else like that, you need to solve this crisis first because you're literally just not allowed to give any new what's it called, like new like papers which say that you are allowed to build. Like there's no way to do this. So this is also why this is in the news, and this is why this is somewhat like an important body to know. Um, as I said, it's also been criticized by the farmers movement to be too left-leaning. Now, you also like a motion you could think of based on this will be this house would make the advisory council, or this house would make the council of the state democratically elected. I don't think this is a good motion. But then again, bad motions have been set at tournaments, so it's good maybe to prepare for this. The idea here is that you would say it is not because it's like today democratic right now, and therefore we should have some form of accountability, and there's already backlash. So therefore, this would solve this. The couple of issues that one, like the farmers movement is not big enough to really make this scare. Like they really went down in votes the last elections, and even in that election cycle, this was part of the kind of like the news and campaign and that kind of stuff. But there were other parts they also focused on, and it's never been big enough that it's been able to mobilize some people that this backlash warrants such a big change. Secondly, a lot of it is like unanimous and seems to be quite well functioning right now, especially because it is just an advisory body. Like you could talk about whether we should maybe give this a like voting power. So you could say a policy gets struck down. But the problem with this as well is like again how policy works is this policy gets either advised before it goes to committee, before it goes to the second chamber to be discussed, and afterwards in the first chamber to be discussed. And then you could say after that it might get struck down. So it's just about when do you get policies that struck down, rather than whether you have a potentially undemocratic body striking these things down. At which point, I don't think it's much of an interesting motion because it just would seem like, yeah, maybe if you do it quicker, it will be good because in the end, it will get struck down anyways. And you don't have the harm we have with the nitrogen crisis, which is that you have all these things now we can't build because you just had a bad policy. Um, so yeah, this is definitely one of those things you could consider. As also something to consider when you talk about specific parties getting into power. You could talk about how advice is given and that kind of stuff. You could say, especially what happened with the last government, is that they just ignored this kind of like advice. but you can say there's already been signs, and this might be like a good way to kind of like show that there's might be ways in which policies will get uh listened to and will be good. So this is kind of like a way to prepare for it. So this is an interesting point to know just about law and advocacy and how things get changed. I don't think there are many good motions you can actually solve this, but again, maybe some people will try. Then at least you're prepared to show why this motion works or doesn't actually work. Okay, now let's just go to some advice reports. I'll just speed run this a bit because the main idea I just wanted to give is that there's a lot of research done in the Netherlands, and there's a lot of like bureaucracy, and it's more about the consequence of those. But I do just want to go quickly around it to kind of like show you what the possible ways are for accountability of the government and vice versa that exist. So the first thing is the ombudsman, which basically means that if there's some way that you disagree with a decision body of the government has made, you can go to them. This can be for benefits, this can be for the police, this can be done for um like also the institution that gives you like your driver's license. You can go to them. They will just fix it. They'll be like, oh, you do not agree with this. There might be like they might mediate. They might just give you advice like actually we agree with them. All of this kind of stuff, which is a cheaper way to do this because like they're really free compared to just to hire like a legal team to kind of like deal with potential issues with the state, which is why it exists. Other things that you can have is, is a very bad translation, but in Dutch it's called de rekenkamer, which I call in English the calculation room. And it's literally just there's a body which just checks not only the money flow of ministries to see where is the money being spent, but also shows that things like efficacy. So it's not even just like you have corruption and like are you giving it to a friend, all this kind of stuff. It is more specifically about why it is that um, you have, for example, like a policy not being implemented. We say we want to have more economic growth, and then you have a budget, and then the budget goes to specific companies or specific projects, and it finds out that it's not being efficacious. Is this because government projects are inefficiently run? Is this because you have made errors selecting kind of like companies and that kind of stuff? Like this does research into that and also shows kind of like the numbers for that. So it allows for further research and questioning all this kind of stuff. And also there are a shit ton of advice reports. Like it's a bit of a headache and a bit of a complete like clusterfuck for what's actually happening. But you have a central planning bureau which just like gives like wanted and unwanted advice to the second chamber. You have the scientific council, the social affairs council, and these are always kind of like a mix between being selected by the cabinet or like being like technocratic or like being proposed and that kind of stuff. But the main idea is that they tend to be somewhat quasi-independent of the state, and they do give quasi-independent or just fully independent from the state and give advice. And then this is just about advice bodies outside of the ministry, because even every ministry itself has advice bodies. It has also like sometimes independent government assigned uh, and like bodies, which are sometimes called like population bodies because they are made up from the population. And you also have um, like other like advice things. So for example, this might be for example an organization that has to do with benefits and assigning benefits and that being independent, also like a control body with that. It's also independent from the minister, so that you don't have one minister having a lot of power and never having so much things changing when a new minister comes up. Um, and also accountability against the state and also to the specific minister. So it is very complicated. So why am I telling you this? Firstly, I think it kind of like explains why there overall isn't maybe as much corruption or a lot of problems. I'm not saying that there is no corruption in the Netherlands, because this is a big statement to make, but it shows you that there are so much checks and balances, either from independence from the state, from like giving a lot of like research, which is accessible to journalists, from also just like literally just like a calculation of just checking like money flow, which means that even if something goes wrong, there's a lot of accountability there, which means that then there are claims being made about a minister completely fucking things up the way that maybe, for example, Trump is completely changing up minister bodies, or maybe the extent of corruption that might happen something like, I don't know, Bulgaria just doesn't happen in the Netherlands because of this accountability, and also does mitigate the harms a potentially quite or relatively radical right wing party like the PVV is able to do. So even though the PVV was in power and had a couple of like ministries within, they weren't able to really do as much damage to it because of this. This is important to nuance when you're trying to impact populism comes into power or not. Another thing that it nuances is motions which are about this house supports X policy, or a motion that somehow leads to a specific party coming into power. Um, so let's say again, you might have a new party come to power who isn't as well versed within politics. You could say the fact that you have so many advisory bodies, the fact that you have so many kind of like accountability mechanisms, previous research that you can assign to, so many accountability mechanisms, really limit the amount of things they can do in the form of bad things. You could also say it becomes very overwhelming and very hard to navigate. And you can also say that this kind of like leads to very slow policy because what happens is you have all these advisory boards and all these things giving you feedback and all these changes, and when you don't implement them, you either get backlash or accountability, which means it becomes slower and slower and slower. But you can say it might be good for these new parts with new ideas, but it's very slow, it's very hard to implement, or you can say it becomes easier for them to implement because of all these advisory boards and ways in which you already are able to have done research and like build it on that and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like characterizing how policy will be made and whether it will be of a good quality or not. So that is overall the idea of this. I think to a certain extent, if you want to talk about voters, a lot of this quite like people might know about these things, but isn't necessarily much of a voting issue where it is something that people really have a dislike for one of these specific institutions. Like I said, they tried to do this also with the BBB, but there was also a lot of pushback where a lot of like, talk shows and like shows kind of like did say, well, hey, actually it's quite good because it's very independent and it is very unanimous. So, how much harm is there really? This is kind of like being overplayed by the BBB, the Farmers Party. So yeah. Now let's say you have a specific motion. This is just a very generic motion. So you say this house would give X council. This can be like, for example, scientific council, or like a council for the future generations, or a council for like green environment, that kind of stuff. A veto power of policy. This will be something that you can discuss, and then you can discuss, hey, this is overall a good thing or not, will possibly be good or not. Backlash, all this kind of stuff, where you can already then now have the nuance of what is the alternative. Councils like this do already exist. Where will they be used? This is like different from maybe the committees that also exist within Parliament, of this kind of stuff. So again, I'm not going to go into detail for this specific motion, but just an idea of how you can use this information in potentially debates. Now,